The hospital corridors were eerily silent, save for the faint echo of hurried footsteps. My name is David Gibson, and I've always prided myself on being a man of science, not sentiment. But tonight, something about this case unsettled me more than I cared to admit. The girl, Alice, was no ordinary patient. She wasn't just sick, she was elusive, almost ghost-like in her refusal to be found. I could hear Rob Palmer's voice cracking as he called out repeatedly, "Alice, where are you?" Each call reverberated through the sterile walls like a plea into the void. It felt less like searching for a child and more like chasing shadows. When we finally located her, huddled in the farthest corner of the dimly lit room, my spine tingled. Not from fear, but from frustration. This wasn't supposed to happen. A doctor shouldn't have to hunt down their patient like some fugitive hiding from justice. Her tiny frame curled inward, as though trying to disappear entirely. For a moment, I wondered what could make an 8-year-old retreat so deeply into herself. Was it pain? Fear? Or perhaps something darker that none of us dared to imagine? Rob stood beside me, his brow furrowed with concern. He glanced at me, expecting guidance or reassurance, anything to steady his nerves, but all I could muster was a curt nod. If there's one thing I despise, it's uncertainty. And Alice was nothing if not uncertain. As head of internal medicine, I'm used to solving puzzles, piecing together symptoms until they form a coherent picture. But this was different. Every instinct told me that beneath Alice's silence lay secrets far more dangerous than any illness. We approached cautiously, each step deliberate yet weighed down by unspoken tension. "Alice," I said firmly, breaking the suffocating quiet. My tone betrayed none of the unease clawing at me. "We're here to help." But even as the words left my lips, I knew they sounded hollow. How could she trust us when she couldn't even trust herself to speak? In that moment, I noticed something peculiar, a glimmer of defiance in her eyes, fleeting but unmistakable. It struck me then. Alice wasn't merely afraid of us. She was protecting herself from what? I couldn't say. Yet. But one thing was certain. Whatever haunted her wasn't confined to these hospital walls. It was rooted much deeper, festering in places we hadn't yet dared to explore. The room felt suffocating, as though the air itself was conspiring against us. Alice lay on the hospital bed, her small frame writhing in agony. Each spasm that coursed through her body seemed to defy logic. Sharp, unpredictable, and utterly debilitating. Her breathing grew shallow and beads of sweat dotted her pale forehead. For a fleeting moment, I thought she might slip away right before our eyes. "Alice!" Rob's voice broke through the chaos, but it did little to calm the storm brewing within her frail form. I stood frozen for a second, my mind racing but finding no anchor. Appendicitis? It didn't fit. The pain wasn't localized, it radiated unpredictably across her abdomen. And yet, every instinct screamed at me to act, to do something. But what? The lack of clarity gnawed at me like an open wound. My frustration boiled over when I realized the extent of the complication: asthma. That cursed condition rendered nearly all diagnostic procedures impossible. No scans, no invasive tests. We were flying blind, and one wrong move could send her spiraling into respiratory failure. Or worse, her parents loomed nearby, their presence both a plea and a threat. Peter Green, with his stern gaze and rigid posture, exuded an aura of impatience. He paced back and forth, each step echoing ominously in the cramped space. "When will you figure this out?" he demanded, his tone sharp enough to cut glass. Mary stood quietly beside him, wringing her hands as though trying to squeeze answers from thin air. Their desperation hung heavy in the room, pressing down on us like a leaden blanket. "Dr. Gibson," Rob muttered under his breath, pulling me aside. His face was etched with worry, the kind that doesn't fade easily. "We need a decision, now." "A decision based on what?" I snapped, unable to contain my irritation. "Her symptoms are all over the map. She can't even breathe properly without risking a collapse." Rob hesitated, then leaned closer, lowering his voice further. "What if we're missing something bigger here? Something psychological?" I scoffed, shaking my head. "Psychological?" In my experience, such talk only muddied the waters. Yet deep down, I couldn't deny the unease creeping up my spine. There was something profoundly unsettling about Alice's silence, about the way she clung to herself as though shielding some terrible secret. Molly appeared at the doorway just then, her expression unreadable. She glanced at Alice, then at me, before stepping forward cautiously. "How's she holding up?" she asked softly. "She's not," I replied curtly. "And neither are we." Molly nodded slowly, her eyes narrowing slightly as she studied the scene before her. Then, with quiet determination, she approached Alice's bedside. Leaning down, she whispered something I couldn't hear. To my astonishment, Alice's trembling eased ever so slightly. Turning back to me, Molly said, "There's more going on here than meets the eye. You know that, don't you?" Before I could respond, Peter interjected brusquely, "Enough with the speculation. What's the plan, Doctor?" His words struck like a whip, snapping me out of my thoughts. I straightened, forcing myself to project confidence I didn't feel. "We'll proceed with surgery," I announced, ignoring the knot tightening in my chest. It was a gamble, a dangerous one. But what choice did we have? As preparations began, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were walking into a trap set by forces beyond our understanding. The clock ticked mercilessly, counting down to a reckoning none of us were prepared for. The operating room was a symphony of tension, each beep from the monitors amplifying the weight of uncertainty. David stood at the head of the table, his hands steady, but his mind restless. Alice's lifeless form lay before him, fragile and pale under the harsh surgical lights. "Scalpel," he muttered, his voice devoid of emotion, though inside chaos reigned. He had made the call to operate despite his doubts about appendicitis, a decision born not of confidence but of desperation. Every second that passed without clarity felt like another nail in her coffin. If this surgery failed, if his gamble proved wrong, there would be no coming back for Alice. Or for him. As the incision was made, the team worked in silence, their movements precise yet heavy with unspoken dread. Then came the moment of truth. The appendix was exposed. David paused, staring at it intently. It looked normal. Too normal. No inflammation, no signs of infection. Just a small, unremarkable organ sitting innocuously in its place. The air thickened, suffocating everyone in the room. Rob let out an audible exhale, breaking the fragile quiet. "It's clean," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. David clenched his jaw, fury bubbling beneath the surface, not at anyone else, but at himself. How could he have been so blind, so reckless? Back in the ward, Molly watched Alice closely, her instincts screaming louder than ever. The girl's eyes darted nervously toward the door every time Peter entered, as though anticipating punishment rather than comfort. There was something deeply unsettling about those fleeting glances, something that gnawed at Molly's gut. She approached David later, her tone measured but urgent. "There's more going on here," she insisted. "Her father, he's controlling, maybe even abusive. Did you see how she flinches when he speaks?" David frowned, irritation flaring. "Molly, we're doctors, not psychologists. We deal with facts, symptoms, and people," she interrupted sharply. "People who feel and suffer and hide things because they're scared. You saw what happened in surgery. This isn't just physical, it's psychological." Her words struck a chord, though David refused to admit it. Still, he couldn't ignore the growing unease in his chest. Was it possible they'd missed something crucial? Molly pressed on, her resolve unwavering. "Let me talk to her alone, without the parents, please." Reluctantly, David agreed, though his pride stung at the implication that he might have overlooked something so fundamental. As Molly returned to Alice's bedside, armed with patience and a doll to bridge the gap between them, she knew the answers lay hidden behind the girl's guarded gaze. And whatever those answers were, they held the key to saving Alice. Not just her body, but her soul. The hospital corridors seemed quieter than usual, but the tension in Molly's chest was anything but calm. She had spent hours piecing together fragments of Alice's story, each revelation chipping away at her resolve like waves against a fragile cliff. The girl wasn't just sick. She was trapped. Trapped in a world where love came with conditions, rules, and relentless scrutiny. Peter Green loomed large in this narrative, his presence casting a shadow so oppressive it felt suffocating even to those around him. Molly remembered the first time she saw Alice flinch under her father's gaze. It wasn't fear. It was something deeper, more primal. A survival instinct. When Mary mentioned cutting Alice's hair short to control her habit of chewing it, Molly's heart sank. Control? The word echoed bitterly in her mind. This wasn't about control. It was about domination. Every strand of hair Peter trimmed away symbolized another piece of Alice's autonomy being stripped from her. And yet, instead of curbing the behavior, it only fueled it. The shorter the hair, the more desperate Alice became, stuffing strands into her mouth as if trying to fill an unspoken void. What broke Molly's spirit most was discovering the truth behind Alice's compulsive habit. At first glance, it seemed harmless, a nervous tic perhaps. But as she delved deeper, speaking softly to Alice through the guise of dolls, she realized it was far darker. The act of chewing her hair wasn't merely a reflex. It was a cry for help, an outlet for anxiety that had nowhere else to go. Each swallowed strand told a story of neglect, of a child yearning for comfort in a home devoid of warmth. Mary's confession gutted Molly further. "He does it because he loves us," Mary whispered, her voice trembling with equal parts conviction and despair. Love? How could such cruelty masquerade as affection? Peter worked tirelessly to provide for his family. Yes, but at what cost? His rigid discipline crushed Alice's spirit, leaving her isolated and broken. And Mary, poor Mary, bore the weight of silence, choosing compliance over confrontation. She loved her daughter fiercely, yet her inability to stand up to Peter made her complicit in his tyranny. "She thinks she deserves it," Molly muttered aloud, her fists clenched tightly. Alice didn't see herself as a victim. She saw herself as flawed, unworthy. Her father's constant surveillance, the removal of her bedroom door, the cutting of her hair, had eroded her self-worth until there was nothing left but shame. Even now, lying in her hospital bed, Alice avoided eye contact, shrinking into herself as though expecting punishment for existing. But the discovery of the hairball in her stomach changed everything. Nearly a pound of tangled strands, compacted and rotting inside her young body. Molly stared at the grotesque mass, bile rising in her throat. This wasn't just a medical anomaly. It was evidence of years of psychological torment. Peter's actions weren't just misguided, they were destructive. By attempting to fix Alice, he had created a monster within her, one that threatened to consume her entirely. As Molly relayed her findings to David, her voice quivered with barely contained rage. This isn't appendicitis, it's abuse, emotional and psychological. We can cut out the hairball, but unless we address the root cause, Alice will never heal. David listened silently, his expression unreadable. For once, he didn't argue. Perhaps he finally understood. Some wounds ran too deep to be stitched shut by surgery alone. The revelation hit Molly like a thunderclap, sharp and unrelenting. She stood frozen in the dimly lit examination room, staring at the grotesque mass of hair clumped together in Alice's stomach. It wasn't just hair. It was years of pain, neglect, and suffocating control compacted into a knot so dense it could have choked the life out of her. The pieces finally fell into place. The gnawing anxiety, the compulsive chewing, the father's oppressive regime. This wasn't merely a physical ailment, it was the manifestation of a fractured soul. Asthma, Molly whispered to herself, pacing back and forth as realization dawned. It's not genetic. It's neurotic. Her voice grew louder, almost frantic. Alice's asthma isn't an illness, it's a cry for help. Every symptom pointed toward one undeniable truth. Alice's body was crumbling under the weight of chronic psychological stress. The hairball wasn't the disease, it was the consequence. And if they didn't act fast, the consequences would prove fatal. Convincing David and Rob, however, felt like scaling an insurmountable wall. When she burst into their office, clutching the x-rays and test results, her hands trembled, not from fear, but from urgency. Listen to me, she demanded, slamming the files onto the desk. This isn't appendicitis or gastritis or anything else we've been chasing. It's trichophagia, a disorder caused by extreme emotional distress. David raised an eyebrow, his expression skeptical. Tricho what? Molly, you're reaching. No, I'm not, she shot back, her voice rising. Look at this. She jabbed a finger at the images showing the tangled mass in Alice's stomach. Her father cut her hair short to control her behavior, but all he did was make it worse. She started swallowing more strands because she couldn't stop herself. This isn't about discipline. It's abuse. Rob leaned forward, rubbing his temples. Even if you're right, and that's a big if. How does this explain the abdominal pain? It's inflammation from the hairball, Molly exclaimed, exasperated. And her asthma? That's psychosomatic. Chronic stress manifests physically, especially in children. Don't you see? We've been treating symptoms while ignoring the root cause. Alice is drowning, not just in her own hair, but in her family's toxic dynamics. Time was slipping through their fingers like sand. Alice's condition was deteriorating rapidly, her breathing shallow and labored. Each passing minute brought her closer to collapse. Molly knew she had to push harder, fight dirtier. David, she said, softening her tone to appeal to his pride. You were wrong about the appendix, but you can still save her. Let me prove this theory. Run the tests. If I'm wrong, I'll step aside forever. He hesitated, his jaw tightening. Finally, with a reluctant nod, he relented. Fine. Go. Molly sprinted down the hallway, adrenaline coursing through her veins. As she explained her findings to Rob, his skepticism melted into awe. Almost a pound of hair, he murmured, examining the scans. I've never seen anything like it. Neither have I, Molly admitted, her heart pounding. But we need to act now. Emergency surgery, it's our only chance. In the operating room, the team worked with surgical precision, extracting the monstrous clump piece by piece. Molly watched from the observation deck, her fists clenched so tightly her knuckles turned white. For the first time since the case began, hope flickered faintly on the horizon. But it was fragile, like a flame in a storm. One misstep and everything could unravel. The operating room was a battlefield, and every second felt like an eternity. The surgical team moved with precision, their hands trembling not from fear but from the sheer weight of what rested in their grasp. Alice's life. The hairball, a grotesque mass nearly a pound heavy, had burrowed itself into her stomach, causing inflammation so severe it bordered on catastrophic. David stood at the helm, his brow furrowed as he worked to extract the tangled monstrosity without causing further damage. Careful, he muttered under his breath, though the warning was more for himself than anyone else. One wrong move could tear delicate tissue, sending Alice spiraling toward internal bleeding and certain death. In the observation deck above, Molly watched through the glass, her heart pounding like a war drum. She had fought tooth and nail to convince them of the truth, to make them see that this wasn't just a medical anomaly, but a cry for help buried deep within Alice's psyche. Now, as the surgeons labored below, she couldn't shake the image of Alice clutching her doll, whispering secrets only Molly seemed able to hear. This wasn't just about saving a child. It was about dismantling years of emotional neglect and control. Time slowed to a crawl. The silence in the room was deafening, broken only by the rhythmic beeping of monitors and the occasional murmur of instruction. Then, finally, the moment came. Got it, David announced, holding up the extracted mass. It looked alien, unnatural, a testament to the horrors Alice had endured in silence. A collective exhale rippled through the team, relief washing over them like a tidal wave. But David's expression remained somber. This isn't over, he said quietly, almost to himself, not by a long shot. When Molly entered Alice's recovery room hours later, the girl was awake, her eyes wide but wary. Molly approached cautiously, sitting beside her. You're going to be okay, she said softly, brushing a strand of hair from Alice's face. But we still have work to do. Healing isn't just about fixing your body. It's about mending your heart, too. News of Molly's discovery spread quickly, earning her praise from colleagues and gratitude from Alice's parents. Peter, once stern and unyielding, now sat slumped in a chair outside the ward, his face etched with guilt. Mary clung to him, tears streaming down her cheeks. For the first time, they began to confront the damage their choices had inflicted, not just on Alice, but on each other. Molly didn't revel in her triumph. Instead, she felt a quiet determination settle over her. Saving Alice had been a miracle, but the road ahead would be fraught with challenges. As she walked away from the hospital that night, the weight of responsibility pressed heavily on her shoulders. She had saved a life, but rebuilding one would take far more than surgery. Alice's story wasn't just a medical mystery. It was a mirror reflecting the cracks in humanity itself. Beneath her silence lay not only pain, but years of unspoken anguish, buried so deep that it had manifested as both physical illness and emotional ruin. Molly understood this now more than ever. Patients weren't merely symptoms or numbers. They were people with stories, fears, and scars etched invisibly into their souls. The hairball in Alice's stomach wasn't an anomaly. It was a scream for help, one that no stethoscope could hear and no scalpel alone could fix. The Greens household was a ticking time bomb, fueled by Peter's suffocating control and Mary's passive complicity. Love, when wielded like a weapon, became toxic. Every strand of Alice's chewed hair told a story of neglect, fear, and self-destruction. An endless loop of punishment inflicted not by strangers but by those who claimed to love her most. If left unchecked, such wounds festered, turning children into shadows of themselves, their spirits crushed before they even had a chance to bloom. This wasn't just about Alice. It was about every child silenced under the weight of misplaced discipline. Control isn't care, Molly whispered to herself, clutching Alice's file tightly. Love isn't earned through obedience. It's given freely. Her revelation struck her like lightning. If doctors failed to see beyond charts and tests, lives would slip through their fingers. And if parents couldn't learn to nurture instead of dominate, tragedies like this would multiply, each one darker than the last. The clock was always ticking, louder for some than others. For Alice, it had nearly run out. But her survival wasn't just a victory for medicine. It was a warning shot across the bow of society. Parents everywhere needed to hear this. Your child's heart beats with emotions you may not understand, but ignoring them won't make them disappear. They'll simply find another way to be heard, often at great cost. Some people leave scars, others leave lessons. Burn and reborn stories that break you, then rebuild you.